Friends, I'm afraid we've reached the end. The final episode of Øredev Debrief Week 2024. Big week, but alas, it'll soon be over. But before that, in this episode, I sit down with Ingrid of Sandeberg to talk about AI. Her keynote, which is of course in the episode information, dove deep into the challenges of living in a world with lots of generated data, knowing what to trust, and so many other important issues. In our chat, right before the keynote, we started by talking about the interesting dangers of hiding big statistical models behind a natural text interface. And for the last time this week, big thanks to Øredev for inviting Kodsnack again. They paid for the trip and the editing time for these keynote recordings, but they have no say about the content of the episodes. Let's roll the final chat. I'm already looking forward to next year. Right. Welcome, Ingrid, to the podcast stage.
Thank you.
Or the warm-up stage, I guess, in this case.
Yeah, I think
We're
it is.
going to see your keynote very soon.
Yeah.
And we started talking before around AI, a part of the topic, we should say.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we set off in some interesting directions when we were talking before. I don't know, where's the best point to start? The first thing I wrote down was AI equals Gen AI, question mark.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because I think for the past 2 years since ChatGPT was launched, the first one, I think the definition of AI has gone from a more wide or sort of all-encompassing definition to sort of equating it more with Gen AI and LLMs.
Yeah.
And I get that because for most people who are not coding, Gen AI or LLMs is how it's the first opportunity for a normal person in quotation marks to actually interact directly with an AI model through natural language, right? And I think also in a developer context, this is also where sort of an LLM can start translating between like code language and human language as well. So most co-pilots are also, of course, LLM based. But I think we're sort of forgetting that AI is a lot wider as well.
Yeah.
And I work a bit with AI in a sort of wider context, whereas when it comes to LLM, like they're super powerful and they're so revolutionary in so many ways, not the least in terms of democratizing access to AI models. But on the other hand, they're language-based, and language is unstructured. So it's very probabilistic, and it's really very hard to get like high accuracy because accuracy is hard to define. Right? That's also something I'm going to discuss in the keynote later on. But what is like truth and what is accurate language, right? And I think we're sort of missing a little bit about the probabilistic nature of the models if we're just relying on the language, because if we're using LLMs and not knowing anything about the statistics behind it, it's really hard to understand what type of errors can occur. Yeah, or why don't I get the same answer to the similar question? Yeah, things like that. That's true. I think that also, like, if I ask you a question, you can phrase it in different ways as well, but you're probably going to mean it more or less the same. But I think it introduces sort of an element of randomness in a way that many users can't really foresee or can't really relate to because they don't really know how they work. Yeah, and computers in general have taught you that, you put one thing and you get something out, and that something will be the same thing usually, or at least very similar. Exactly, but that's also something that sort of you as a developer will know. Or as a sort of a data scientist or computer scientist or data engineer or something, you will know that as well. But I think what's interesting with these models is that they're oftentimes used by non-technical users. So they're just relying on their sort of semantic understanding of what's being written or said or generated in terms of imagery as well. And they're really trained to sound very true or sound very good, but they're not really trained to be truthful or to be very or have sane. A concept of it even. Exactly, but it's very easy because they're really made to sound very, very persuasive. And they are, but it's like a different type of errors are introduced. It's like I used to work with autonomous vehicles and perception systems for autonomous vehicles, and in autonomous vehicles you have 5 levels of autonomy. Right? Where you start like 0 is basically there's no autonomy. But then you have like passive ADAS, for example, which is advanced driver assistance systems, and that could be like a back camera or something.
Yeah.
Like it's passive, but it's aiding the driver. And then you have active ADAS level 2, which is like farthållning, so like
speed control and
speed control, exactly, or cruise control.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's it.
And then you have level 3, which is where you have like Tesla and Waymo and stuff today, which is basically it can handle a lot of situations autonomously, but you need to have a driver still, and you need to have a steering wheel. The driver can be remote, but there needs to be a person in the loop because, somebody needs to be prepared to step in. Then you have level 4, which is basically you can handle most situations. When there are corner cases, you can stop safely or just get out of it. And level 5 is, I think, fairly utopian, but basically assuming there are no corner cases.
Yeah.
And level 3 is really wide because the number of instances or the frequency of required human intervention is going to be reduced, right?
Yeah.
But I can't imagine anything less safe than like being required to step in at some point, but it's like it's less and less often. So the less often it is, the less prepared you're going to be. And I think it's kind of the same a little bit with the LLMs today, that they're sounding better and better, and they're becoming actually better at being accurate. But there is this chaos element because they're not actually able to define what's true themselves.
And the sort of better they seem, the less aware you become that there might be a mistake, or the less you assume that there will be errors.
Yeah, and it's like if I were to say, if we're talking text, for example, if I were to proofread a text you've written, I'm going to look out for the same type of mistakes or blurbs that I would have made, right? Typos, grammar, stuff like that, odd sentences. But if it's AI generated, the types of errors that are introduced, they're not something I would recognize. And it's kind of the same with code. A lot of people are using AI to help generate code, but it's introducing different types of coding errors. And then that's perpetuated if nobody discovers them. And it's a little bit like it was mentioned, I think it was yesterday or the day before in one of the side talks, about how some of the sort of LLM hijacking is that when you're asking it to generate code, it's going to generate some source code, and then it's going to generate some links to libraries. But those libraries can be phony. But then if you're a hacker or like a malicious actor, you can identify like commonly occurring referred to phony libraries, then you can actually create that library, right, with malicious code. So it's like it's harder for us to judge whether or not it's whether or not there's an error, because it's not the type of error we'll make. So, and I'm actually going to make some examples as well during the keynote.
A quick but huge thank you to everyone sponsoring us on Coffee. You too can become one of them by surfing to ko-fi.com/KODSNACK. Kodsnack, and giving us either a one-time donation or monthly support. If you support us on the coffee drinker level of €5 per month or more, you get a bunch of very nice stickers in your actual physical mailbox. And if you support us on the barista level for €10 per month or more, you also get a thank you right here. Big thanks to Albin Groen, Svante Richter, Anders Legell, Brother Ingo, and Tobbe Lundberg. Everyone who supports us helps make the podcast possible, and the more of you there are, the better we can make the podcast. We do sometimes have sponsors, but it's actually your support which is making it possible to cover our monthly costs. And if you want to support us in other ways, you can, of course, give the podcast a review in your podcast player. That also helps a lot. Give it a thumbs up, a star, write a comment, or whatever your player supports. Or, of course, simply tell someone who might like the podcast about an episode. And remember, you're a fantastic person whether you support us or not. And I guess that means, I haven't really thought about it before, but that means that it will make a big difference. Even if the models were not to get any better, it will make a big difference over time that we learn what kind of errors to look out for. And that in itself can provide more utility. Because like you said, you proofreading my text, you know to look for certain errors. I will learn what kind of errors LLMs are likely to make when I ask them to write code, for example.
I suppose so. If there's a systematic, if there's like a normal distribution and some types of errors are more commonly occurring, but then we're also going to give it feedback, right? So I suspect it's just going to morph over time.
Yeah, absolutely. But
unless we teach it more like guidelines for what is correct.
Yeah, but it just struck me because I can easily get into the grumpy stage where I think they will never learn, they will never get better. But even if they weren't, we could still get more utility over time because we could learn what kind of mistakes they make.
Yeah, hopefully, if they're using the same mistakes,
yeah.
because they do learn over time.
Yeah, of course,
right?
They do keep changing. That's also part of the excitement, so to speak. And back to generative AI and not being everything, but it sort of took over as the label for everything. Or generative AI became sort of.
Yeah, and I can sort of see that because there's so many use cases where natural language is useful or making it simpler.
Yeah.
But again, these models are quite general for them to be able to know language. Right?
Yeah.
They have to be super general, but I think generally speaking, the more general a model is, the worse it's going to be for any specific use case.
Yeah.
Right? So on the one hand, they're going to be fairly unprecise in given contexts unless you specialize, unless you make them specialized. And also, they're extremely energy inefficient.
Yeah.
But I also think that we're seeing sort of a trend towards SLMs, or like smaller language models, which are more specialized, has more domain expertise, etc. I know that I think it was in September, Hugging Face reached like 1 million open source models, and many of them are smaller and domain specific, etc. So I think that's a positive trend.
That's going to be really exciting. Get a small model that I can play with myself and maybe train one for my data.
But for your specific use case.
Yeah, exactly.
Because again, I think you want to use specific sources, etc. And if you're just looking very generally, I mean, it's a classic example from when they developed the page rank at Google, right?
Yeah.
Then you rank pages, like you search for cancer, and then all of the internet or all of the pages are indexed in terms of how relevant is it in relation to cancer, but also what quality does this source have on this specific topic or in this context, right? And that's relative. So if you search for cancer and Financial Times is writing about cancer or the Mayo Clinic is writing about cancer, then of course both are going to be relevant, but the Mayo Clinic is going to have a higher quality, probably of the in terms of the result, right? But if you then train your models, like you do some RAG or something based on domain-specific context, so you only use sources with a higher level of credibility for your specific topic, then of course it's going to be much more accurate, quote-unquote, or useful, or whatever, for your specific purposes.
Yeah.
And also it's going to take much less energy to train them, and the inference is also going to take much less energy.
That's a lot of exciting stuff to be gained there, definitely. And another thing that you touched on when we talked before was this fact that this text interface to LLMs is both exciting and also kind of dangerous because it hides what they really are in a way. They're not actually working with text.
That's the thing, right? And I think for most people who are for a developer, for example, is fairly familiar with code, then you kind of understand the logic, and then kind of how to probe it. You know how to prompt engineer properly, the normal fallacies, that you have to double check if there's specific facts.
Yeah.
But if you don't know about just the general underlying statistics, then it just sounds very plausible. Yeah.
Yeah, and it becomes it feels even more likely that it can probably do anything, and
exactly.
It may well be right, but it probably knows better than I do.
Exactly, or it's referring to some library. Or in my instance, I've been looking at, for a keynote, for example, it's give me some cool statistics on this stuff, right? And then it shows up with some cool statistics, and I'm like, okay, what's the source? And then there's a link that's just phony.
Yeah.
Or so it's really, it's persuasive, but it's you're discussing with somebody who's just who know they've been caught lying, and they're just digging themselves lower and lower.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'll let you go set up for the keynote.
Is it time?
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time.
Inte tipsa en bekant om podden. Eller lämna en recension i till exempel iTunes. Eller något annat ställe där det går att sätta betyg på poddar. Du kan också stödja oss genom att köpa oss en kopp kaffe på Coffee. ko-fi.com/kodsnack. Alla pengar går direkt till att göra podden bättre och trevligare. Du kan också komma och hänga i vår Slack-kanal. Länk finns på kodsnack.se, precis som alla andra länkar och all annan info kopplat till varje avsnitt. Sist men inte minst finns det också en länk till vår Spreadshop-butik där du kan köpa tröjor och andra prylar med Kodsnack-tryck. Återigen, tusen tack för att du lyssnar. Vi hörs!
Let me put it this way, Mr. Raymer. The 9000 series is the most reliable computer ever made. No 9000 computer has ever made a mistake or distorted information. We are all, by any practical definition of the words, foolproof and incapable of error.